I'm Nick Newton, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On tonight's episode, we will talk about the latest in recruiting. Some freshmen received some recognition this week on the Florida football team. Caleb Banks announces his intent to transfer to Florida from Louisville, and we will wrap up with a preview for the Las Vegas Bowl. Will, we set these topics usually a couple days in advance, but since we set them, man, news of the passing of Mike Leach, 61 years old here the last couple of days. Leach, one of my all-time favorite coaches, just highly quotable, highly entertaining guy. We've certainly debated the merits of his offense here on this show many times over the last year here, but I'll tell you what. Mike Leach loved watching his teams, loved his personality, fun guy to watch get interviewed, and just going to miss him in college football, but gone too soon at 61.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is obviously his wife and kids and grandkids and those sorts of folks. Prayers out to them, just because
Yeah.
obviously there's the football aspect of it, but there's certainly a human aspect of it as well. It's been really interesting to read about him today. I mean, I knew he was a transformative figure from the standpoint of the air raid offense and developing that and pioneering it with Hal Mumme at Kentucky, and then going to Oklahoma and winning. He didn't actually win the championship there with Stoops, but was an offensive coordinator that Bob Stoops brought there to Oklahoma. Gets the job at Texas Tech, goes 11-1. No one's come close to going to 11-1 in Lubbock since he left. And then the stops at Washington State and now Mississippi State have seen him have varying degrees of success, but never quite can get over that hump. And the interesting part when you read about it is the personality, I think, scared off some of the high level programs where, having this guy as necessarily the front of the program wasn't something that they necessarily wanted to do. At the same time, you go back and you read about how he got into football, the sacrifices he made, taking a job for $3,000, even though he had a law degree, just because he's like, well, like if it doesn't work out, I'll be able to go back to law school. Like having that sort of gravitas, like having those sorts of stones to be able to go do that is in many ways, I think, why he was successful, right? That he was able to not care what other people thought, be himself. And by being himself, he could do things that other people didn't think about. And that included running this offense that people thought was a gimmick and that people thought wasn't going to work. And that, you'll never be able to teach the quarterbacks to be able to essentially call the plays when they come to the line of scrimmage. Having all these option routes instead of traditional route trees isn't the way it's done. Completely revolutionized college football, high school football, and even the NFL. There are a ton of air raid concepts now that go on within the NFL, and certainly I think defenses have been able to catch up to it in some respects, and in many ways that's one of the reasons why the offense is less successful than maybe it was at Texas Tech. But certainly a pioneer in college football, a pioneer in football overall, and just a sad day because beyond the football, the quotes and the stories and the pirate and all that sort of stuff was a personality, and that's always one of the things I think is fun about college football. And Mike Leach added to that is the personality of guys like Steve Spurrier. I mean, even guys like Phil Fulmer, who didn't really have much of a personality, but when you had Steve Spurrier picking on him, it sort of brought out the personality of Phil Fulmer. Now you got Lincoln Riley, who's a Leach disciple actually, but Riley now the turncoat from Oklahoma to USC, and you've got all these you got Brian Kelly down there at LSU faking a Southern accent. And so all the personalities of college football, and Leach was sort of the ringleader of all of that, right? He is sort of that quintessential, quirky, innovative guy who gets an opportunity in college football and is able to succeed there.
I loved having him at a place like Mississippi State too in the SEC, where he did a great job at Texas Tech, Washington State, Mississippi State. Here, these are not by any means traditional powers, right? Here, college football has no problem stepping in there and giving that a shot. Brought about some great games. You go back to the Crabtree catch against Texas during the 2008 season. Washington State was always one of those highly entertaining teams to watch late night football. And I'll tell you, even in the SEC, he's been, you go up against Alabama, he's gotten smoked a couple times there with that Bama matchup. But outside of that, Mississippi State's one of those teams they could pop off and take down about anyone outside of Alabama and Georgia in the SEC on any given week here under Leach. And it's terribly sad news, total tragedy to lose a guy at 61 that early, man. I feel for his family, wish them the best, but man, it hasn't fully hit me that we're not going to get any more of Mike Leach, man. It just sucks. So hope for the best for his family though, Will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, let's dive in here to the show tonight. We'll talk about two bits. Let's go into the recruiting scene. Big weekend last week. We did record the show prior to the Lagway commitment, and even though we did a separate episode for Lagway, let's just real quick talk about the meaning of that Lagway commitment, Will, how that's going to pay off for building that 2024 class.
Yeah, I mean the big thing is he's now got two of the top 9 quarterbacks who've been signed at Florida since 2000. And so from the standpoint of is one of those guys going to work out, chances are one of them's going to. So whether it's Lagway or whether it's Rashada, who actually was upgraded to a 5-star on 24/7. So not the 24/7 Sports composite, but was upgraded to a 5-star at 24/7 Sports today. So you've got two guys, very, very high level guys. Think about how Clemson built their program. Taj Boyd, Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence. That's how they built that program. And, when you had the normal Clemson recruiting class and Kelly Bryant at quarterback, you got smoked. Once you got through the ACC, you got smoked when you got to the playoff. When you had Trevor Lawrence or when you had Deshaun Watson, you were able to compete with Alabama. And so that's really where you're sitting. It's the most important position on the field. Lagway is a better prospect than Rashada, but they're both very, very good prospects. And so Florida now has these 2 lottery tickets. And, you need you need a guy every year of Rashada's ilk in order to make sure you deliver on a quarterback. You probably only need 2 of Lagway just based on his profile, both high school stats, but also his overall QB, his overall ranking nationally. And so a very, very big deal for Florida, a big deal to bring in that 5-star candidate. And now you combine Lagway with Miles Graham, and you've got the 2 highest rated recruits that Billy Napier's ever had committed in that 2024 class. Gives you an opportunity to build that one into a monster. I think the ship has kind of sailed on 2023 to turn that into a real monster class. And so the hope is that with NIL, sort of getting your feet wet with that and the changing landscape of college football recruiting, that perhaps year 3 will be the time when Napier's able to put it all together, both from a collective perspective, from the Gator Guard perspective, from an NIL perspective. And now you've got Lagway with, a year to recruit. And you talk about bringing in high level wide receivers who are going to want to play with a guy like that,
Right.
and bringing in high level offensive linemen who are going to want to play with a guy like that. And part of it is you don't want to get too excited because it's a year out, but part of it is you're a year out, and so you have an opportunity to get everyone else excited about the program, the direction of the program, where it's going. And so for a couple of different reasons, that's a really big commitment for Billy Napier and a big deal.
Yeah, Lagway will serve as a magnet to continue to amplify that 2024 class. Just huge deal to get a guy like that in early on. Let's talk about this past weekend, the last weekend here for the visit before the big man, Pancake Honcho, I believe he goes by online here. Samson Okunlola, will big guy, tackle out of Massachusetts here. He is ready to commit. I believe his decision is going to come down on Thursday of this week. Hey, Florida, I think we were not so much. It felt like we heard his name early, didn't hear much for a while, and then Florida has come on a little bit late here in this race for Okunlola. Will, who's it between, and what would it mean to get him in
I mean,
this
it looks like
class?
it's going to be between Florida and Miami,
Mm-hmm.
and that's sort of what a lot of these battles have come down to, is Florida and Miami, and Florida's come out on top a couple. Obviously able to flip Rashada, and that I think is a pretty big deal. At the same time, Cormani McClain goes to Miami, and that was sort of a last minute deal from what Florida's folks were surprised when McClain decided to go to Miami, and so nothing's done until it's absolutely done. Jakeem Jackson, also the cornerback. You went and saw live, actually, Jakeem Jackson. He's also somebody that Miami's been trying to flip, came in this weekend for an official visit and basically shut down his recruitment. But again, there have been a lot of those Florida-Miami battles. Okunlola looks to be one of those again. And, it's going to come down to a lot of different things, I'm sure, but NIL is probably going to play a pretty significant role. For Florida specifically, you've got Bryce Lovett as an offensive tackle down in like the 600s. You got Roderick Kearney, the flip from Florida State, who's in like the hundreds, but he's more of a guard. And then you've got Najee Harris, who's also a guard, who's sort of in that top 300, but not necessarily a top tier guy. You want 4 offensive linemen every class. And the distribution of the rankings and the distribution of the profiles for these guys, really, it goes from an okay offensive line class, if you bring in another sort of offensive lineman in the 300, 400, 500 range, to really almost an elite offensive line class, considering Kearney's in the hundreds, Harris is in 300s. And then if you bring in Okunlola, who's top 20, all of a sudden you've now got the buildings of something up front that could be really, really special, especially considering the two offensive line coaches and what Billy Napier's been able to do with offensive linemen that have not been heavily recruited. Look, left tackles are pretty easy to evaluate because the foot speed and what they can do and how they can handle things like that typically are things that you can see. It's pretty much like a defensive end. Like, a defensive end is good when you see them. I think quarterbacks are harder to evaluate. I think sometimes running backs can be a little bit hard to evaluate, but guys like wide receivers, linebackers, defensive ends, and offensive tackles are pretty easy to evaluate. You don't typically miss on these high range guys or these high level guys when it comes to evaluating 5-star prospects. Pretty much every offensive lineman who's committed to Alabama has wound up in the NFL. It's not a coincidence. They've all been 5-star guys for the most part. And look, I think Okunlola profiles is one of those guys. So from the standpoint of having somebody who's going to step in, Richard Garage, actually the left tackle for Florida, just announced he's going to go to the NFL. Or at least he announced he's going to go into the Senior Bowl, which is usually, then progressing to the NFL. And so from that standpoint, Florida has an open spot at left tackle. And, if it's filled by Cameron Waits, that's okay. But if it's filled by a Samson Okunlola, everybody's going to be very, very pleased.
Yeah, a lot of things you look for in a left tackle, including, is the dude named Samson? That's an awesome name for a tackle, man. I get this guy in here. It would make an elite class for the offensive line. After what you saw from the team this year with the running game and how that offensive line played, if you get building blocks like this in with this group, it would be very exciting to see. Well, one question for you, though. Looking at what we saw out of Miami this year on the offense, looking at what we saw out of Florida on this year on the offense, I said one of the advantages that I saw on the field with Florida is we've at least established somewhat of an identity with that running game up front. This is going to be a program that's dedicated to running the ball. It's a group of coaches that can develop at an NFL level. Is there any level of advantage? Obviously, you got Alex Mirabel, I believe, is coach down there at Miami, and Mario Cristobal, who knows a thing or two about offensive line development. Certainly two good choices for Samson there. Is there an advantage, though, to the fact that Florida seems to have established that identity a little bit, and it's a little clearer picture of what you're going to get versus what Miami's still kind of selling the concept in the future a little bit down there?
No, I don't think so. I think the first year you pretty much have a clean slate. The sales pitch at Miami is going to be, these guys weren't the guys we needed here to make things successful. You're the guy we need here to be successful. I think Napier's making the same pitch. It's not as though Florida went 10-2 and Miami went 5-7. It's
no, but more of a clear vision of what the offense is going to look like in terms of running the ball.
I just don't believe that. I don't think that showing it on the field makes any difference for the first recruiting class. It just doesn't. It might make a difference for next year's recruiting class to have shown that sort of identity and remaining true to the thing you've been selling and those sorts of things. But no, I have seen zero statistical evidence that on-field success in year one translates to recruiting success, and NIL only further complicates that, right? That there are going to be things that are going to tug people at different programs that have nothing to do with the best interest of their 4-year career, where they want to actually spend the time, how they get along with the coaches. And again, I don't know anything about Okunlola specifically, but to think that somebody ranked 20th in the country at offensive tackle isn't getting monetary offers from different collectives across the country, I think is short-sighted. I'm sure Florida is involved in that as well. And so hopefully the Gators come out on top. But again, I think this is one of the dangers with NIL is you got to make sure that everything fits the player as well as the NIL deal versus just having the highest NIL deal. And I think that's going to be the key, or that's going to be one of the things. And again, I don't fault a player. I mean, if somebody offers you more money to go someplace else, even though it's a poor fit, we've all taken jobs that sucked for the money, right? Every single one of us has done something that we didn't particularly enjoy doing because it paid more than an alternative. And so to think that these guys are going to be any different than that, especially when it's life-changing money, I have zero criticism for them. But I think, from the standpoint of 4, 5, 6 years ago, you might have said that having an identity on offense is going to convince somebody to come here or something like that. I think it's even less likely now. And I think back then it wasn't all that. There wasn't any statistical evidence for it. Does it sway one recruit one way or the other? Possibly, but consistently, there's nothing there to make me say, oh yeah, lean into that. That's going to be something that's a major decision-making point for Okunlola or anyone else.
Too bad. Look at trying to carve out an angle for optimism there. Well, so, all right. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed here, but unfortunately going up against Miami for these high value dude. So we've kind of seen that story play out a few times. So let's see if we can get a different result. So I believe that's Thursday afternoon. We're going to get that commitment out of Oken Lola from Massachusetts. All right, let's talk about some other notable visits this weekend. 4-star UCF commit defensive tackle John Walker, who played Osceola with Jakeem Jackson. By the way, Jackson, dude can hit, man. Physical guy. Played a little offense too. Looks good on the offensive side of the ball. But Walker, along that, I believe Derek LeBlanc, who's going to Oklahoma, who was on Florida's radar earlier in the cycle. Man, those guys did some work up front against Lakeland. And I'll tell you what, Walker seems like a guy that's perfectly capable of playing in the SEC, but instead committed to the hometown Knights. Got him up for a visit with Jackson this weekend. We could use that defensive tackle position. Will be nice to flip a guy like that.
I mean, there are a lot of places where Florida can use help, but defensive tackle is probably the number one place that you'd look at. Obviously, we're going to talk about Caleb Banks to transfer pretty soon. He's also a defensive tackle. So a position of need, certainly a place that Florida, I think, you would hope that somebody in Kissimmee is going to be close enough. If you're fighting against UCF, you'll be able to win that one. You know, we had Bob Redman on Gators Breakdown last night, and he essentially said that everyone's waiting for Walker to pop, but he just hasn't. And so, you know, the question is, why not? Because the rumors have been going around for a while. Everyone has sort of kind of understood that this was probably a fait accompli, but the fact that it's not happening, I think in many ways sort of leans towards USF or UCF, which, you know, hey, all the stuff we've said about Georgia and Alabama and Miami and Clemson, you can't be losing 4-star recruits to UCF. And so, you know, this is one that I think Napier, if he's going to, it's time to close the deal on a guy like John Walker, and hopefully he's able to do that. But, you know, it's, I think it was very clear that Redmond was confused that the commitment hadn't happened yet. And whenever that happens, I start going, uh-oh, like that means there's either confusion on the player's part, or the player isn't necessarily giving a complete story to the people who are sitting there inside. I don't have inside information, and Bob didn't say anything specific about it other than everyone's waiting for him to commit. And the fact that he hasn't committed yet, I think, is one that's sort of perplexed everybody.
Certainly would be a good pull if we can end up pulling off that flip there. 4-star Stanford tight end commit Jaden Platt is in the mix here. He visited this past weekend. Stanford, obviously, you saw David Shaw ended up resigning after their final game, so a lot of their recruiting classes up in the air. And tight end, also a desperate position of need here for Billy Napier going into year two.
Yeah, I mean, you got Tony Livingston, who was gray shirted, Hayden Hansen, and Arliss Boardingham in last class. There's nobody at tight end in this class though so far. And for a team and a guy who wants to run 2 tight end sets, I mean, you can't run 12 personnel if you don't have 2 tight ends. So you know, that's just the reality is Napier wants tight ends, but he's not necessarily going to just settle, I don't think, for just anybody. And so Platt's sort of a guy who was on their radar early and then committed to Stanford. And now they're sort of getting an opportunity to come back and take a bite at that apple. But again, that's one of the difficult parts, right? Is that if you're a kid who grew up valuing education, you have the grades to get into Stanford makes you a scholarship offer. Obviously, there's a little bit of turmoil there at Stanford with the turnover from David Shaw. At the same time, you know, Stanford, UF's a good school, but Stanford sets you up for life from the network and and all that sort of stuff. And I gotta be honest, if I was a kid who was, who was from Texas and I had the option, and I'm going away from home anyway, right? Like I'm either going to Gainesville, Florida, I'm going to Palo Alto, California. Palo Alto would have some appeal. So I love Gainesville. It's one of the best places in the world to me, but at the same time, Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, being out there where all that stuff goes on in California. There's a lot to do when you're going out there. Plus the education in Stanford.
And how many SEC championships does Stanford have? As the 3-year Letterman would say, how many SEC titles do they have? Will?
Hey, how many guys have they put in the NFL? I mean, that's the thing that if I'm Platt, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at how many people have they put in the NFL? How many people have they put in the coaching ranks? And how many people have had their lives set up by being at Stanford and having that sort of connection with those alumni? Don't know that answer, but you know, that there is, we often sort of scoff at the scholarships or look at the scholarships as like a minor part of all this sort of stuff. And oftentimes that's true, right? I don't know if there's a huge difference between like from an educational perspective, but choosing between Alabama and Auburn. There's a pretty big difference between Stanford and some of the other schools, especially because Stanford's one of the few schools that has competed pretty regularly at a high level. and is one of those academic schools, right? They are not the Vanderbilt of the Pac-12, at least not anymore. They may have used to have been, but Harbaugh came there, sort of turned that around. Shaw was able to keep that going until the last couple of years, and so there's still hope to win if you're there. They've won some Pac-12 championships recently. I'm not saying Platt's going to go there. I'm just saying that's the competition, right? The competition for Platt seems to be Stanford. That's where he had committed originally, but with the transition going there at Stanford, I think it's opened it up, and certainly Napier needs tight ends for what he wants to do. And we saw it last year that there was a lot of 4 wide, there was a lot of 3 wide, one running back, one tight end. Those are not formations that if you watch if you watch Louisiana a couple years ago, that's not what they did. Right now, part of that is Anthony Richardson trying to make things more spread oriented for him and all that sort of stuff. But a big part of it is just there's no benefit to having substandard tight ends out there. If the guys can't block and the guys can't get open, you might as well put out a wide receiver and change your numbers that way. And that's kind of what Florida was forced to do this past year.
Well, Stanford, they just hired a new coach, Sacramento State coach, totally blanking on his name, but I like the hire. So they still might be in the mix for, you got to think he's going to do everything he can to try to pull those guys back in. 4-star running back Mark Fletcher was also on campus this weekend, originally committed from that South Florida area, originally committed to Ohio State. I've seen him as a Miami lean for a long time, Will. So I was actually surprised when I saw him coming up to Florida. I know we've been kind of in the mix for him a little bit, but I just think with where the running back room is and the fact that we got a run back commit here, I just feel like Fletcher, this is kind of a reach here. I'm not sure if he's going to be end up a Gator here, Will.
Well, so I don't know as a reach, but Trayon Webb is somebody they already have in the class. Certainly, you've got Lorenzo Lingard leaving. You had DeMarcus Bowman leave before the season. Naquan Wright's gone into the transfer portal. So you're losing a lot at that position. You figure Montrell Johnson's probably gone after next year, and then Etienne's gone 2 years from now, and you're looking at a pretty thin set of running backs. You're going to have to bring in more than one in one of these classes, or you're going to have to start rating the transfer portal. But I think you're right about Fletcher specifically. Florida was trying to get Richard Young. They were trying to get Cedric Baxter, and Fletcher was not necessarily high on the list if they had opportunities to get those guys. Those guys have chosen to go elsewhere. Young's going to Alabama. Baxter, I think, is going to Texas. But so those guys are going elsewhere, which means now you're sort of working your way down that list on the board. Have they gotten in too late for that? Perhaps. And Fort Lauderdale is not a hotbed place for Florida to bring in guys. I think that's actually the story of this weekend. It was something I was thinking about as I was looking at it. So Walker's from Kissimmee, but then you've got Okunlolo, who's from Massachusetts. You've got Caden Jones as the offensive tackle, who was in the other offensive tackle who was in ranked 489th overall. He's from New Orleans. Then you had Fletcher from Fort Lauderdale, and you had Platt from Hazlet, Texas. So you think about like what we've talked about all season long or all off season long about building a circle around Gainesville. None of these guys are in that circle. And I think that's sort of one of the reasons why the guys who came in the week before, the guys like Desmond Ricks, the guys like Jordan Hall. I mean, Ricks is from Montgomery, Alabama, but Hall's from Jacksonville. And so those are the guys I think that, you probably have a better shot at. So I'm not going to go into early signing day or whenever Fletcher ends up committing thinking, oh yeah, he's a Florida lean. I think it's a big deal to get him on campus. At the same time, these guys get 5 official visits, right? And so even if you're committed someplace, unless you're committed to Clemson, where he doesn't let you like even pretend like you might commit someplace else, Dabo there, unless you're committed to a school like that, why not take the free trips to these universities, have a good time, do the photo shoot, get wined and dined, and then go commit where you're going to commit? I mean, there's no harm to doing it. So yeah, getting somebody on campus, it's a big deal. It's nice to have that guy there. But again, I'm not getting my hopes up for guys who aren't necessarily right where Florida is going to be recruiting 90 to 95% of the time.
Yeah, if we did get him, certainly could use him. Just not super optimistic on that front. All right, let's move on to Forbits. Talk about some honors here, particularly some freshmen making headlines. Florida offensive lineman Austin Barber was named to the College Football News freshman All-American first team, while running back Trevor Etienne and linebacker Shamar James earned honorable mention honors from CFN All-American. Etienne and Shamar James are also named to that freshman All-SEC team, Will. And I know that's something you've harped on in the past, where there is a correlation to that freshman All-SEC team to eventually building the type of team you need to break through and win an SEC title.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when I look back at Napier's 2022 class, there were 5 guys who were top 300 recruits. They were ETN, Chris McClellan, Shamar James, Devin Moore, and Kamari Wilson. And all 5 of those guys contributed more than, I mean, most of those guys contributed a lot, right? I mean, ETN had 110 carries for 705 yards. Shamar James, 40 tackles, 2 sacks. McClellan, 21 tackles, 1.5 sacks. Kamari Wilson, 33 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss and a forced fumble. And then Devin Moore played in 5 games and had 6 tackles and got injured. So he's probably the one who contributed the least, but none of those guys redshirted. Right. So Napier got guys right off the bat contributing. And Barber is one of those guys. Obviously, he's a redshirt freshman, but having an offensive lineman being able to step in when Tarquin went down with an injury, hey, now Florida has 2 tackles, right? Because you're going to have Barber and you're going to have Tarquin coming back. And so you're not necessarily hard up to put a freshman or an inexperienced guy in there. Yeah, I've harped on the freshman all SEC because those guys tend to turn into all SEC guys at some point down the line. You go look at the freshman all SEC team from 4 or 5 years ago, you're going to see a who's who of elite SEC players eventually. And there's a reason why Alabama gets a bunch of all SEC players, because they end up with 6 or 7 guys on the freshman all SEC team that they bring in. So I think it's a big deal to have some of them there. Florida hasn't had anybody there in a while. I think Kyrie Elam made it a couple of years ago. Other than that, I want to say that might be the only guy that they've had. And in fact, if you go back and look at Mullen's 2018 class, they had 13 top 300 guys in that class, which is interesting, way more than Napier did, but not necessarily as much top end talent. But the only real guys who contributed were Pierce, Lucas Krull, who was a junior college transfer. And I mean, he didn't contribute a ton, but these are guys who played more than redshirt is what I'm sort of looking at. Van Jefferson and Trevon Grimes, who were both transfers. And then you had Amari Burney and Trey Dean, who contributed. Dean probably had his best season as a Gator. They're coming in as a cornerback when Florida's starting corner went down with an injury. And Burney played quite a bit on the defensive side, 12 tackles, 2 tackles for loss. So, my point is that out of all those guys, it was really just Pierce, Burney, and Dean who contributed. And then if you look at the 2019 class for Mullen, it's sort of the same story. At 10 top 300 guys, the only guys who even contributed at all were Chris Bogle, Diabate, and Kyrie Elam in that 2019 class. So Napier has already proven that he's going to get young guys in. Those young guys are going to contribute. Some of that is they needed it, right? Especially on the defensive side of the ball. They needed help. And those guys weren't even really able to deliver the kind of help that maybe we wanted. At the same time, I think it suggests that, from an evaluation standpoint, being able to bring in high-level guys who are going to be able to contribute early, we should have a little bit of faith that Billy Napier is going to be able to get that done, just because what we saw from James, Etienne, McClellan, Moore, and Wilson. And then you add to that Austin Barber ending up on the freshman team as well. And you got a bunch of young guys who are really contributing to the team. If you get that same number of young guys who can contribute next year, all of a sudden you can see this team jump from 6-6 to potentially 8-4 or 9-3, because the talent level is there. It's just a question of, do you have enough depth? Do you have the ability to pull people out when you need to? And do you finally have enough experience? So, Shamar James playing a ton at linebacker. Ventrell Miller's gone. James is going to have to step into that role, but he's ready to, because he played a ton this year. Same thing with Kamari Wilson, right? Trey Dean's gone. Now Wilson's going to be able to step into that role, and he's ready because he played a ton, right? And did he make mistakes? Absolutely. Was he a little bit small this year? Absolutely. He's going to have to get a little bit bigger. But those guys getting out on the field and contributing, I think, is going to be a big deal. Same thing with McClellan, right? You got Jervon Dexter leaving for the NFL after the bowl game. McClellan's going to get an opportunity to really show out next year as sort of the starting defensive tackle. So, yeah, I think it's a big deal to have these guys on the all-SEC team, freshmen. Obviously, they have to make that conversion, but, I think I've mentioned this a few times. Bill Sykes wrote a really good article about clustering for SEC championship teams and getting everybody to sort of mesh at the same time. That's a big deal. He's going to have to get freshmen to mesh with these freshmen. Otherwise, you end up with 2, 3, 4 all SEC guys. The best you can hope for is an 8-4 season. You really need 8 or 9 guys at that level to truly succeed. And if you think about James, Etienne, and Barber's junior year is going to be 2025, right? You're going to have Jaden Rashada, or 2024. You're going to have Jaden Rashada in his second year. You're going to have DJ Lagway coming in as a true freshman year. And you're hopefully going to have a bunch of these guys like Trayon Webb and Aiden Mizell and Eugene Wilson and Roderick Kearney and Cameron James and Kelby Collins and Will Norman and TJ Searcy, all these guys coming in. Not all of them are going to work out, but hopefully 3, 4, 5 of those guys make the freshman all-SEC team. You're ready for that cluster to hit. when the quarterback comes in, if the quarterback can hit the ground running and be elite. Now, look, it's going to be up to Napier to make sure that Rashada or Max Brown or Lagway can do that. But if he can do that, you potentially have the base now for that cluster to happen there in the 2024-2025 seasons.
Yeah, that was an exciting part about this 6-6 season. 6-6, never a good season. Big difference in last year's 6-6, in my opinion, because you saw a lot of these guys very young. They stepped in positions of need, and I think that's a positive sign for Napier that he can not only identify that, but address it quickly. We'll see more of that next year because we're going to need it. We're going to be young. I just wrote an article this week on Read and Reaction, Will, where Napier, I calculated the number last week. It's not going to be correct. It's going to change every freaking day with the way the transfer portal goes and everything. But at that point, I calculated 54%. He had turned over 54% of the roster from 2021 already, just a year into the job.
It's clearly a different approach, right? Dan Mullen still had a majority of Jim McElwain recruits during that 2020 season, including Kyle Trask as his quarterback. But you had Pitts, who was somebody that he brought in that was part of Mullen's first recruiting class, but had been committed to McElwain. And then you had Kadarius Toney as the other big weapon there, who had committed to McElwain as well. So the three main cogs, and plus pretty much the entire offensive line, was McElwain recruits, and you start factoring and you start going, well, why did things fall apart in 2021? Well, in many cases it was because Emory Jones took over. It was because you didn't have Pitts around anymore, and Dante Zanders was your third tight end, and Lucas Kroll, who only had a year or two of eligibility, was your second. It's because Jacob Copeland and Justin Watkins didn't really work out. Copeland was okay, but Watkins get kicked off the team. It's because you had Richard Garage, Noah Banks, and Chris Blake at offensive tackle, and Banks got hurt and Blake transferred out. Andrew Chatfield and Malik Langham at defensive end, Marlon Dunlap at defensive tackle. Then you had David Reese, the other David Reese, who was always getting hurt, John Huggins and Randy Russell, who both didn't play any role for different reasons. So you start looking at it and going, geez, out of the transition class, Dameon Pierce, who wasn't used very much, is probably one of the best players, along with Pitts. And then Evan McPherson is maybe the third best player in that 2018 class. So I think we're going to be able to say with pretty good certainty that from this 2022 class that Napier brought in, he's the Trey Smack, the kicker, will not end up being the third best player from that class, just based on what we've seen from James Etienne and Kamari Wilson and Chris McClellan. I don't think Trey Smack's going to be the third best player in that class. And the fact that I can say that with a straight face, that's the reason why Florida has struggled, because those recruiting classes that Mullen brought in were, 14 in the first one and then like top 10, but they weren't delivering anywhere near the way that 2022 class just delivered for this Florida team. Now, look, the Florida team went 6-6. So it's, hey, they delivered and they played pretty well, but they still went 6-6. But the question is, can you chain 2, 3, 4 of these classes together? And the 6-6 won't be there anymore. I actually kind of disagree with you. I think last year's 6-6 team was better than this year's 6-6 team, but I think it was necessary to take a step back and and establish all of the turnover. And part of establishing that turnover meant you took a step back this year. I think Mullen tried to sort of play it both ways, not have that turnover so that he could go 10-3 and 11-2 in those first couple of years. And he paid the piper in year 3 towards the end of the season and year 4. And I think based on what Scott Strickland said about wanting a long-term sustainable program, turnover makes sense, and it's going to be painful early on. And that's sort of what we felt this year.
Yeah. It's good to see the results are starting to come through, and in some small ways. You got to take the small victories where you can find them, Will. Another didn't include this in the freshman section here, obviously, but another award to mention this week, Osiris Torrance, lineman he identified at Louisiana, brought him over. Osiris lived up to every bit of the hype and more that he had coming in with him as a transfer from ULL. First team All-America honors, Will.
Yeah, obviously, Torrance, congratulations, you get your brick. It's hard to be a unanimous all-American at offensive guard. And so, being able to be all SEC and potentially, did he make the All-American team as well? I'm assuming he's going
first team All-American. Yeah.
I'm assuming he's going to. So, All-American, all SEC, gets his brick. And from the standpoint of, could he have delivered anything more? Not really. I mean, the offensive line was great. Florida's running game was great. Didn't give up any sacks, didn't get any penalties, those sorts of things. And actually, again, I think if you go and look at who Napier targeted the transfer portal, I think we all expected him to have more guys come in through the transfer portal, but Jalen Kimber, he was a contributor. Osiris Torrance, certainly a contributor. Ricky Pearsall, a significant contributor. Chickasha Bowman was even a contributor towards the end of the year. And then Montreal Johnson, obviously a large contributor. So the transfers who contributed significantly. The elite guys he brought in contributed significantly. And again, if you look back at the guy, Mullen sort of did the same thing, though. I mean, he had Van Jefferson, Trevon Grimes, and Adam Schuler as big time transfers who came in and contributed. And so, the question is going to be, are they going to rely on the portal, which is kind of what Mullen did, right? I mean, Mullen then brought in sort of a second wave with Jonathan Grenard and some other guys. And then all of a sudden they were like, oh, we're weak on the defensive line. Let's bring in guys like Daquan Newkirk and Antonio Valentino and Tyrone Truesdell. And that didn't work out so well. So I think it's okay to use these transfers who are contributing to start with to sort of establish the process. But I'm actually hoping, like my hope is that Florida doesn't go raid the transfer portal. Go sign 32 guys in the 2023 class in that 100 to 200 range. And then, sort of pick and choose the guys that you want and the best guys from that range. And, you've got enough lottery tickets to that point that you may deliver. I'd much rather see him build through the high school ranks than try to go raid the transfer portal, because we've already seen that show and it doesn't work out that well if you miss.
To your point, Will, and this is something that you've hammered consistently. Georgia, the last 3 cycles, I believe they signed eight guys in the transfer portal. Ohio State 6 and Alabama 13. That's combined over the last 3 cycles. So
how many of them are playing too? That's the other aspect.
Well, Georgia, we know 2 of them were Newman and Daniels, the quarterbacks that did not play. So that was 2 of the 8. I mean, you see, Alabama had like a Jamison Williams hit. Ohio State,
Jamar Gibbs and
Dustin Fields was a transfer at one point. So you've seen some of these stories, but I'll tell you what, there's a lot more stories. Emory Jones wasn't pretty out there at Arizona State this year. That season didn't go great. I mean, he kind of had to transfer if he wanted to play, and that was a difficult situation he stepped into out there. Copeland didn't light it up at Maryland. You go look at all these guys who think the transfer portal is the answer. There are a hell of a lot more disappointments in the transfer portal than there are Joe Burrow, Justin Fields type stories out there, Will.
Yeah, we'll see this year, right? I think oftentimes guys transfer because they're either not getting playing time or they're not getting along with their coach. I don't know whether NIL is going to change that. And so if guys are leaving because they have an opportunity to get a better deal someplace else, maybe guys who are more successful are, I don't think we would have seen Devin Leary transfer years ago from NC State. I don't think we would have seen Grayson. I don't think we would have seen Grayson McCall, quarterback from Coastal Carolina, transfer years ago. I think, there's been some, the Wake Forest quarterback,
Sam Hartman.
There's been rumors about him. I don't think you would have seen him transfer years ago. There was even rumors about Drake May, right, having an almost Heisman year there at North Carolina, and rumors about him potentially in the transfer portal. That wouldn't have happened years ago, right? Drake May comes out his freshman year, plays really well for North Carolina, and he's preparing for his sophomore year because he's getting, he's basically trying to prop them up to be a major player, as opposed to having to deal with those sorts of rumors. So how many elite guys are going to be in the transfer portal this year? I don't know. What I do know is there's going to be some musical chairs and there's going to be some guys left standing, and you're going to be able to pick probably some quality guys who fit your program when sort of all the dust settles. And so do I want Florida getting into NIL battles over guys in the transfer portal? Only if you think the guy's going to be part of a national championship. Like, to me, that is the criteria at this point. I would rather have Kamari Wilson play more snaps than bring in a safety you think is slightly better than Kamari Wilson if it costs you anything in the transfer portal. I think there's value in getting Jaden Rashada snaps at quarterback rather than bringing in some guy from a different system for 1 year to see if he can prop up your record for 2023. Now, that doesn't mean that you put in Rashad if he's not the best player, but it does mean that you're not necessarily bringing in guys to put in his way along the path. And so, look, Napier's going to have to sort of thread that needle, because the fans are not going to stand for another 6 and 6 year. That's for sure. And so, you can't just sit there and say, we're developing. This isn't Philadelphia with the 76ers where we got Embiid out injured and we're waiting for the process. And, Sam Hinkie's here just like trading everything for draft picks and strafing the team, because you don't get higher draft picks for having a worse record, right? And so there is value to to sort of building the momentum and those sorts of things. But I don't know. I know people are going to look at me and be like, oh, he's old school, he's an old man, whatever. But the data suggests that high school is where you build the program. The transfer portal is where you supplement it. And if you're going to try to build the program with the transfer portal, I think you're trying to build it with fool's gold. I think you're going to run into problems. And I don't think the transfer portal is going to be any cheaper than high school. And so if the prices aren't any cheaper now, I guess so. And let me delineate that. What I just said about the musical chairs and people are going to be left standing, that is going to be cheap, right? You're going to be able to, there'll be people who will be like, oh my God, I'm getting an offer from the University of Florida. Yeah, I'll go there. Scholarship's fine. That's all I want at the end. But those guys are just depth pieces, right? Those are guys who maybe one or two will hit. Those are guys to come in and be your backup in case, on the defensive line, you have a couple of injuries and those sorts of things. You're not going to bring in an impact defensive tackle for nothing. Those guys are going to have offers to go places, and investing in those places at this timing in the program, I think is probably unwise compared to the high school level.
Alabama and Georgia lose a lot more to the transfer portal than they bring in every single year.
Well, no, then they bring in through the transfer portal.
That's right. That's what I mean.
And it's intentional. Like the transfer portal is essentially.
If your theory was wrong, though, I think the best programs in America wouldn't operate that way. So you see it consistently. Ohio State's the same thing. A lot more guys leaving than coming in through the portal.
Well, and I don't think that, there's probably multiple ways to actually win if you really want to do it. I think college football is a little bit unique in that there may only be one way to win, but there's no harm in trying it in a different way. The issue that I think you're running into is anybody who's getting pushed into the transfer portal for Georgia or Alabama, like essentially the transfer portal is now a guilt-free way of culling your roster. Right. So you sign 5-star guys. One of them doesn't work out. You don't have to hold him on the roster forever. You basically make him uncomfortable, put him in the transfer portal, and all of a sudden you have another roster spot. And so the transfer portal, I think you saw the thing with Leach the other day with the guy who went in the transfer portal, basically said Leach thinks I'm lazy. He doesn't think I'm any good. That's why I'm going to the transfer portal. It was like at the bottom of his announcement.
Leach doesn't think I'm tough.
That's right. Leach doesn't think I'm tough, which was amusing at the time, a little bit macabre now, but
still amusing. Leach
but still, the point is that these coaches are paid to manage the roster and make sure they have the best 85 scholarship guys out there. And the transfer portal is in many ways less for the players than it is now for the coaches. The coaches will complain about it, I can't manage my roster and all that sort of stuff. Nah, the coaches who are good at this stuff understand. Like they're going to keep they're recruiters, right? They're going to keep the guys who are excellent there, and they're going to push out the guys who are borderline and bring in guys who have a chance to be better. And that's what's going to happen. And so I think it's actually going to be a roster management tool for the most part. And I think it's going to be buyer beware, even if it's a top tier guy who's leaving. But, look, I mean, how much playing time's Arik Gilbert gotten since he's gone to Georgia?
Well, go to another rival here, Florida State. You signed Johnson from Georgia, who Jermaine Johnson, who panned out quite well, right? Turned himself into a first-round draft pick. This past year, Jared Verse, the kid from Albany, total impact player when he's on the field. And they just got a commitment here in the last 24 hours from that tight end from South Carolina, Jaheim Bell. So some schools, if you could strategically pick and choose your spots and grab a guy here or there, that's the way to go, I think, with the portal, more than relying on it. Like, I think we're going to be a little relying on it this year for more than a couple spots on this roster, Will.
Well, again, though, Florida State went 9-3. That's not my goal at the University of Florida. Right. So good for them. They're 9-3. They're all going to talk about how Norvell's building something there. And then they're going to be stuck at 7-5, 8-4, 9-3 for the next 4 or 5 years with Norvell, or they're going to make a change. And we could have had 7-5, 8-4, 9-3 with Dan Mullen if we'd have just weathered the 21 season. Like, he would have eventually found his way back up to 7-5 or 8-4, right? Like, the guy is an unbelievable offensive mind. He would have found his way to do it. But that's not the goal at the University of Florida. 8-4 ain't good enough. And, so 6-6 you'll tolerate for the first season, but it's not going to be good enough from here on out. But if you show me progress, like if they went 7-5 next year, but Jaden Rashada in the second half of the year was showing, yeah, he's the guy. and you have Lagway coming in to compete with him, and you see Aiden Mizell and Eugene Wilson breaking their way into the starting, that Caleb Douglas is starting to step up at wide receiver, that ETN is becoming RB1, and Montrell Johnson's even sort of fallen a little bit behind there. That you got Cameron Waits coming in at left tackle, not giving up sacks. And look at this project that they brought over from Louisiana, who all of a sudden is a starting left tackle in the SEC. If all those things are happening, then I think you could say, all right, we don't necessarily need to win. Now, the other thing is, if all those things are happening, I think you're probably better than 7-5. So, there's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. At the end of the day, I think the record is going to rely on. The record will rely on Florida's ability to get the most out of their 2022 and 2023 classes next year, along with making sure they have the right guy at quarterback. So, look, if there's a can't miss guy in the portal, even if he's for a year, maybe you bring him in. But, I just look at it and I say, college football is about selling hope. And Sam Hartman doesn't sell me hope that Florida's going to be great in the future. Jaden Rashada sells me hope that Florida's going to be good in the future.
DJ Lagway, Billy could point to that Lagway commitment still and say, it's coming, guys.
But, look, Anthony Richardson was really inconsistent this year, but we now know what we have in Anthony Richardson. Mm-hmm. And the problem in 2021 is that we saw glimpses of what Richardson's upside could be and never got to see the downside of it. And so you looked at it and said, look, that guy gives me hope that this program's headed in the right direction if we can get him behind center the whole time. Didn't work out for the program, obviously, go 6-6 this year, but we now know what we've got. And so, hey, we're on to the next big thing. And the next big thing for me is not going to be Sam Hartman. It's going to be Rashada and Lagway. And so if you bring in a guy at quarterback to sort of just man it, you realize what you're doing is it's a gap year, right? You're trying to go 8-4, 9-3 to sort of silence the doubters in order to then bring a guy in and have him play elite, because Grayson McCall, Hartman, Leary, I can't remember there's kid, a bunch of other guys out there.
Hudson Carr out there too. You're naming the top ones pretty well. Spencer Sanders from Oklahoma State's an interesting name too. And I believe, did I see Graham Mertz was visiting? Did I see that from Wisconsin?
Yeah, let Rashada play.
Yeah, don't. Yeah, if it's Graham, unless it's one of the top 2 or 3 of that list there, I'm cool with rolling with Rashada. Although 9-1 gap year, you could sell me on that concept. I'd be okay with it. I could live with it. Let's move on to 6 bits here. Talk about one of our first transfer portal additions here of the season. Caleb Banks, listed at 6'7", 300 pounds. Only had 2 tackles and 1 sack last season. Comes in from Louisville here. This is from Alan True. He's a national recruiting analyst for 24/7. Says that Banks is a tall, long, lean frame, carries his weight well, and does not look as heavy as listed does not look as heavy as listed. Can easily carry more weight. Fluid athlete who can get off the ball and make plays in the backfield. Can bend and turn the corner, does not project as a weak side speed rusher, but can be a big, strong side guy who can still get to the quarterback. Will, this is a guy that's been described as raw as well. A lot of this is definitely a developmental project, but after we see Scott Satterfield leave Louisville in favor of Cincinnati, became available in the transfer portal, originally from Michigan, but you just look at that size and you see how he moves on tape, and man, this guy's a good athlete coming in here to Florida. I don't know how much of an impact he's going to make anytime soon, but in terms of a guy to develop for a couple seasons and could be an impact player down the road, I think he's worth the risk with these types of measurables.
Yeah, maybe. Look, you can't. When his recruiting profile had him at 6'6", 255. Now they got him at 6'7", 300. So certainly he's put on a little bit of bulk while he's been there at Louisville. Now he hasn't been out there playing all that much, right? He's got 3 years of eligibility left, so you do have the full 3 years. But still, if it takes a year to develop him, you're only getting a couple of years out of him, and that's a spot you've taken up. He was the 968th overall player, a 3-star back 2 years ago in recruiting, and at the time was projected as a Power 5 starter, not a star. And so that, I think, is what you're getting. You're getting a guy who can contribute. You're not going to get a guy who's going to go out there and dominate. Now, I might have said the same thing about Adam Schuler years ago at defensive tackle when Mullen brought him in, a 3-star coming from West Virginia. You sort of looked at it and said, all right, this is sort of a depth piece. And it turned out Schuler was a really important part of the team. So I'm not saying that Banks won't be an important part of the team at some point in the next couple of years, What I am saying is that Adam Schuler isn't playing in the NFL. He was a very good college player who was not a giant difference maker, and I think that's kind of what Banks is projected to be, which is still good, right? I mean, that's still better than what Florida has had at defensive tackle. A rotation player at defensive tackle many times would have been welcome over this past year. And so, a guy who can sort of who has the athleticism to potentially go out to defensive end, but then also come inside to defensive tackle. Like I said, with Dexter leaving, you've got Watson in there, you've got McClellan in there, but certainly need more depth, and Banks is going to be part of that.
Yeah, it's not going to be an addition that's going to have any immediate impact there in 2023, I believe, but we will see a guy like that in a couple years at
I mean,
best.
I don't know, man. I think in order to be successful, he's got to contribute next year. I think in order to call it a successful transfer, like if you're bringing in guys with 3 years of eligibility, it's essentially it's a guy who's a sophomore, right? And we expect sophomores to start to contribute if they're going to be good, because if they contribute, what we really want is we want them to contribute heavily their sophomore year and then contribute significantly their junior year and then go to the NFL. Like that's what you would want with a guy coming in from high school. So when you decide to bring in a guy who's a transfer, and he's got 3 years of eligibility left, you're bringing in a guy as a sophomore. And so he needs to contribute like a sophomore. And if he can't, and he gets bypassed by other guys in the class, that's okay. But then I think we say that was an unsuccessful use of the transfer portal if he's not contributing. Does he need to be a starter? Not necessarily.
High end potential. You're talking about a role player at best in 2023. A minor role player at best, right?
I don't know about minor role player. I would hope he'd have like 20 tackles, like what McClellan did this year, right? I mean, McClellan came in, had 21 tackles and 2 or 3 tackles for loss. I think that would be so 1.5 tackles for loss, 21 tackles for McClellan. I think that's a rotation guy who comes in and plays major minutes on the defensive line. That would be a success. I think if he comes in, has 2 tackles and a tackle for loss, and he's sort of in there in mop-up duty and plays 4 games and that sort of stuff and doesn't contribute on special teams, then you go, all right, like that was kind of a wasted roster spot, considering that you could have brought somebody in from high school who could have given you 4 games, special teams contributions, and a couple of tackles and a sack, right? So I think it all comes down to Napier, his staff, the evaluation, and what they think they can do with him. I don't think that when you bring in a guy through the transfer portal, you can go, well, we need to be patient. I think that's the time where you go, no, we're not going to be patient. We brought you in through the transfer portal because we think you can do something. Go win the starting job. And maybe he doesn't win the starting job, but he needs to be a rotation player on the defensive line next year. Otherwise, I think we're going to be like, like that was a wasted spot.
We'll see. We'll see. All right, let's move on here to $1. Las Vegas Bowl. Kickoff here. We got 2:30 p.m. Eastern at Leach Stadium, which is also the home to the Las Vegas Raiders. So the game time, I believe, was adjusted because the Raiders had their time flexed. Well, cool looking venue, man. I've not been out to see it yet out in Vegas, but it's apparently I've had a buddy that's been out there said it's great place to watch a game. So that'd be cool. You playing an NFL stadium there for the Gators. That's going to be a good environment. Jack Miller starting at QB. Billy Napier announced that last week. Napier said to the media, he has been participating in practice for a number of weeks. He's perfectly healthy while he was rehabbing. We were very intentional about keeping those guys engaged. He's traveled with us. He's went through the process of prepping each week, watching cut-ups, all those things at the end of the week from a test and tips standpoint. So he's been through the prep for a game. Obviously, the volume of work will be a little bit different for him. That'll be the biggest challenge. This is not only the first start for Jack Miller at Ohio State's first start, or at Florida here, first start of his collegiate career, as he also did not start any games at Ohio State, has just been in mop-up duty at Ohio State. And we have not seen him at all for the Gators. So big opportunity for Miller to throw his hat in the ring for the 2023 starting job, Will.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, this is his audition. And with Rashada and Lagway and potentially somebody in the transfer portal coming, obviously he's had an opportunity in practice, especially in fall practice, to show what he could do before he got injured. And I'm sure Napier has an idea, but you never know until you throw a guy in there into the heat of the battle. And one of the problems with Florida's offense is it was extraordinarily hit and miss, right? It could either be really, really explosive or it could be really, really dull. And part of that was the inconsistency of just not being able to hit an 8-yard curl or not being able to hit a guy wide open over the middle. when the opportunity arose. Now Richardson could do really special things even when plays broke down, and had the arm to do some really special things when the play went as it was supposed to go. Miller doesn't have those skills. He doesn't have the same arm strength. He certainly doesn't have the mobility that Anthony Richardson does. I'm not sure anybody does, really. I mean, when you look at Richardson, you kind of think Randall Cunningham and those sorts of guys, not guys who have physical tools that other people don't have. At the same time, I think, look, if Miller knows the offense, and if Miller has spent time looking at film and he can do the consistent things, then Oregon State is not the best team in the country. They went 9-3, but they struggled in many ways. Like, if you look at their actual defensive performance against the pass, they were really, really good when you look at advanced statistics like predicted points added. Against the rush, though, they weren't very good. They were basically, so put it this way, Florida had a better rushing defense based on predicted points added than Oregon State did. And so when you say that and go, okay, well, Florida is a team that likes to run the ball. Obviously, Osiris Torrance isn't there, but Garage still is, and you've got most of your offensive linemen still there and in play. Ethan White played very well this year. You're going to be able to run behind him. You are losing something significant by not having Anthony Richardson run, but you still have ETN, you still have Montreal Johnson. Can Jack Miller sort of be a game manager? Can he be the Daniel Jones of the New York Giants, right? Where he doesn't put them in bad positions, where he doesn't turn the ball over, where he makes the effective throw on 3rd and 6 that maybe Florida's missed over this season, at least every other game. And, are you going to hit the 80-yard bomb? Probably not. But can you make your way down the field in a consistent way that gives your defense an opportunity to rest, not have those 3 consecutive 3-and-outs that doom you there at the, coming out of the half and those sorts of things. And so that'll be the question, is the level of consistency. Now, look, I wrote an article earlier this year, very early, right after Miller transferred, where I compared him to Malik Zaire and DeAndre Francois. So, those are sort of the guys
Ouch.
that I think you're sort of looking at. He's not going to come out there, I don't think, and just light things up. But the benefit is Ben Goldbrinson, who's the quarterback for Oregon State, has a QB rating of 133.6 and has 35 rush attempts for 37 yards. So you think about the guys who've given Florida's defense a lot of trouble. They're guys like Hendon Hooker, Jaden Daniels, even Jerry Bohannon for USF, and then Jordan Travis for FSU. Those are the guys who've lit up Florida's defense, guys who can get away from the pressure. And Ewan Milan and Powell Ryland have been bringing a lot of pressure recently, and just haven't been able to get home against those more mobile guys. They made Stetson Bennett look somewhat pedestrian in that game against them. The ball that bounced off, I think it was Bernie, that bounced to Bowers, that wound up being like a 70-yard touchdown. Like, that was a lot of luck. Obviously, Florida falls behind 28-3, but in that third quarter, they were able to make Stetson Bennett look human. I'm not saying Florida's defense is good. There's no statistic that can back that up. But what I am saying is that Florida's defense is especially bad when they face a quarterback who can run the ball. Goldbrinson's not that guy. And so I think from the standpoint of, is Florida going to be able to get off the field sometimes? I think they probably will. And then is Miller going to maybe be able to keep them on the field more than they have throughout the year? Maybe he can. And if you get that combination, then Florida has a shot to win it.
Over under 65% chance we see Max Brown play.
I mean, I don't know. I would assume that's because Miller has struggled.
What's the percent, over or under?
Over 65% or under 60?
Yeah.
I think it's under 65%. I don't think Napier's going to throw him out there, unless it's garbage time when it doesn't really matter. And that means Florida's either up by 40 or down by 40. And either way, I think we're both. I think if we're up by 40, we're like, well, does that really mean anything? And if we're down by 40, we're all crying in our Cheerios like we were after that Oklahoma game a few years ago. So, I hope not. I would say under 65% that we see him. I mean, maybe you see him for a snap or two.
I think there's a chance you see him in this game.
Well, we'll see. Maybe it's all been a smokescreen. He's been suggesting he's going to start Miller, and Brown will be the guy who comes out and starts.
And that's how we won the Las Vegas Bowl. Notable absences here. You mentioned Miller. Shorter's declared for the draft. AR is foregoing the game as well. Torrance, I believe, is out. Dexter is playing, though. Dexter is in. Oregon State not dealing with quite the same amount of loss here. Luke Musgrave, the tight end, he's opting out, while cornerback Rajon Wright is recovering from thumb surgery. So you talked about that pass defense. That's what their top corner there, Will. I believe he was a first team all Pac-12 selection. So that's a big loss there for Oregon State.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think I think clearly the transfer portal, clearly the defections is going to hurt Florida more than it hurts Oregon State. Oregon State was a 9-3 team this year, but a lot of one-score games. And so you start looking at some of those one-score games and go, some of them were against impressive teams, some of them were not. And the reality is that they do not get a ton of pressure on the quarterback. So I think that's actually the thing to look for is Miller, even in the spring game, got a little bit skittish when there was pressure in his face. But when there wasn't pressure in his face, he was pretty good at delivering the ball well. So Oregon State has 60 tackles for loss this year and only 16 sacks. By comparison, Florida's defense, who was terrible up front, 67 tackles for loss, 21 sacks. So 5 more sacks, 7 more tackles for loss in a much tougher conference for Florida. And so I think there's going to be an opportunity. Florida's defense or Florida's offensive line has not given up a lot of sacks all year. Obviously, you got to replace Osiris Torrance, who was a big part of that. And Anthony Richardson probably bailed him out of a few sacks from time to time as well. But it wasn't like Richardson was running for his life all the time back there. And the offensive line did a pretty good job protecting for him. And so if they can keep that going, Miller's going to have time to throw. And I think that's sort of the, you start breaking down, how do you make a quarterback perform poorly in his first start? Well, you get pressure on him up the middle. You get pressure on him just consistently. You move him from his spot and you make him sort of start seeing ghosts. And Oregon State has not been able to do that to anybody this year so far. And I think if Florida comes in and can protect Miller, Miller's going to be able to put together a decent stat line. I don't think he's going to have a QB rating of 200. I don't think we're going to look at him and be like, oh my God, look at what we're missing. But he doesn't have to have a QB rating of 200. If it can be in the 135 to 140 range, if he doesn't turn the ball over, you got Montreal Johnson and ETN being able to run consistently against an Oregon State defense that's much better against the pass than against the run. And, I think you have an opportunity then to potentially pull this one out. But I mean, this is one of those where I think the score probably varies from an Oregon State blowout to a close Florida win. And, you sort of look at that and go, there's all these possibilities in between. Most of Napier's teams have always, like at Louisiana, but certainly here at Florida this year, have fought to keep the games close. And so I expect to see that again. So I think, I'm not expecting a 30-point drubbing where nobody shows up. I'm probably, leaning towards maybe, I think it's probably
10-point spread in this game. Oregon
10
State,
point?
10-point favorite.
I think Florida covers that. I do. I don't think it's going to be more than 10 points, but, obviously if Miller throws a pick six and
10.5 MGM. 10.5.
Again, however you want to go. Like I would have said 7 was probably like if they'd have put it right at the teaser range where you can tease it down to like 6.5 or 5. Maybe you do that. But nah, I don't know. I think this one's going to be closer than 10.5. That's for sure.
Whole season. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know what we're watching. We'll see what team shows up. If we could run the ball, you think we got a chance to keep it close. They got the freshman offensive player of the year and Damian Martinez running the ball for them. The coach of the year over there, Pac-12 co-coach of the year over there, and Jonathan Smith. They certainly got a lot of good things going on for them this season. This is a good Oregon State team. They might not have the history that Florida has, but this is definitely a very solid football team that even at full strength this year, Florida would need to play a very good game to come out with a win. I think that spread's about right, Will. I'd probably take Oregon State to cover, unfortunately. I'm not happy about it. I hope I'm wrong. I think this is going to be a tough game. We'll see what Napier can do. And hopefully Miller shows out and we can run the ball, and hopefully I'm completely wrong. But we'll see.
Go watch your Buckeyes, you turncoat.
There's just too much missing here, man. If they can put it together, I'd be extremely impressed. It's like you said, the only thing I don't want to see is a Cotton Bowl type performance here. But we got to figure out a way to incentivize people to play in these bowl games too, because that's part of the fun with college football. These bowl games, they were fun when people play, but all these opt-outs and everything, it's just like you don't even know. Like you do the bowl pools and everything, you can't even take them serious anymore. It's like I don't know who to pick because half the players are opted out. Man. It's tough to know what you're going to be watching.
Well, it's like I think you're the one who sent me the link to Josh Pate, who was reciting what Gator Dave's been saying now for a couple of years. Just stick the bowl games at the front of the year, make it a destination there at the end of the summer where everybody can go catch a game in late August. And, the bowl game is essentially a new team anyway, right? I mean, look, we're talking about Jack Miller. We're talking about Osiris Torrance being gone. We're like, hey, Javon Dexter stayed. How nice of him. And, you sort of looking at that and going, what's the motivation and all that sort of stuff. I mean, the Cotton Bowl a couple of years ago is the best example of that. The team clearly didn't want to be there. And so, you sit there and look at that and go, well, what's the benefit, right? I mean, the benefit is that these bowls pay the schools and pay the NCAA or pay the conferences a lot of money for the tie-ins to the bowls. And it is fun to have football around New Year's and all that sort of stuff. At the same time, shoot, put the bowl game at the beginning of the year and move the schedule back a little bit, and just have the SEC championship the week before Christmas or something, and then have the playoff, and you're good to go, right? I mean, the reality is that once we go to a 12-team playoff, nobody's going to pay any attention to the bowls, and so next year really is the opportunity to do that. Set up the bowls, have those be like the kickoff to the season, right? The last week in August, everybody who agrees to do it gets an extra week of practice or something like that. And then, you get that to kick off the season. And can you imagine if you had Florida, Oregon State to start the year next year, and then Florida going out to Utah and so you end up with a neutral site game to start with. Then you end up with a game out in Utah before you even start your SEC schedule. No one would be able to complain that Florida never leaves the state of Florida anymore. That's for sure.
I'm not sure I'm so supportive of that bowl idea for the first part of the season. There's something about I like watching bowl games on New Year's Day, man. That's baked into me. But
you're so wishy-washy. You're like, I can't even do my bowl pool anymore. Bowl games don't mean anything.
I want,
but I still want to be entertained.
Find a way to make it mean something. I'm telling you, the viewership numbers. Everyone who complains about the amount of bowl games there are, the viewership numbers say otherwise. People tune in, they watch. You're going to watch. I think it's something. I feel like Colin Cowherd used to always talk about this, where he'd be like, these bowl games that mean nothing, they get the same viewership as the NBA final, like until the NBA finals. Like, so you're going to have a lot of people tuning in watching. I'm just saying, as someone who watches the games, game in and game out throughout the season, you're just watching a completely different product for these bowl games entirely. And there needs to be a way to incentivize Ventrell Miller to play, AR to play. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see that going forward. I think we can figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, look, I get it. I understand what you're saying. I just, it's a completely different team. And if it was Anthony Richardson still playing, and if you had Osiris Torrance still playing, and all that sort of stuff, it would be like confident. It would be like it was 10 or 15 years ago, right? Where you sit there and say, "Hey, now the SEC played, the Pac-12 played, and now we have SEC teams playing Pac-12 teams, and we can determine which conference was best." We get none of that closure coming out of this, which maybe is part of it, right? College football has always been about, we didn't actually set things up right to where you can actually have some closure on the season. They're getting a little bit better at that with the 14 playoff and eventually with this 12-team playoff of having some ultimate closure. But the conference bragging rights have always been one of the fun parts. The problem is there's always this caveat, right? Of like, well, this team didn't actually show up, and, this team didn't want to be there, and sort of all that.
Well,
stuff.
The SEC rule is if you win, it's because the SEC is the best. And if you lose, we didn't want to be there.
Well, hopefully
it's really a great rule. It benefits us greatly.
So hopefully Georgia doesn't want to be there when they go play Ohio State in a couple of weeks, because that's I got to say something in the comments. I got some flack for not rooting for Georgia because they're an SEC team. Who are you people?
That's
like
ridiculous.
Who are you people? This is unacceptable.
I would listen to that argument for LSU or even Alabama. I would listen to that argument. I absolutely not with Georgia. Absolutely not.
Well, especially if they won the championship last year.
Totally different.
No. Plus, I mean, let's be honest. You and I have gotten an awful lot of joy out of calling them the SEC runner-ups for the past year. And if we can call them like college football semifinalists in our preview magazine, we'll get a lot of joy out of that too. But look,
Heisman semifinalists in college football semifinalists. There we go.
Look, it's unacceptable to be a Florida fan who didn't. If you did your graduate work at Georgia, maybe, but even then, I think you have some judgment problems. But it's unacceptable to be somebody who's a University of Florida fan and root for the leg humpers. It just is. Now, look, if they're 6-6 and Eric Zier's playing, and you wanted to beat Purdue because then you can have SEC supremacy. All right,
I'll give you that. I'll give you that.
And look, I hate the Buckeyes and I hate Michigan. I'm rooting for TCU because I can't stand any of these teams. And certainly, I wish Florida was there. And if Georgia winning reflected well on Florida in any capacity, I'd be like, okay. But no one's going to look at them winning the game and go, oh, that means something for the Gators. No, what it means is harder for the Gators to get to the top. It's like, let's look. Nothing would please me more than to see Kirby just choke one away in the last 5 minutes of a game against Ohio State, where Georgia dominates, but Ohio State finds a way to win. Because let me be honest, That's the only article I could probably write about Georgia where I'd get a ton of viewership from Florida fans. And I look, you're not going to convince me. I don't know who it was that commented. I think I responded because I was in the airport this week. No, you're wrong. We should not root for Georgia.
Never.
Full
No.
stop.
No, you can't give them an opportunity to hang a banner. You can't. Even last year, was it the first thing you started seeing after they won was they split? Oh, 2008, 2008. They flip around and start saying that. But hey, man, you can't give them more opportunities. You just can't. We got to keep denying Georgia as many opportunities as possible.
Choke. Come on,
Yeah.
root for it. Like I don't even I want it to be painful. I don't even want it to just be like a loss. I want it to be painful. So either Ohio State win by 50 and run in a touchdown with 30 seconds left and just let Kirby stare at Ryan Day, or something stupid where they like you remember that punt that Harbaugh had a few years ago with Michigan State that got blocked in return for a touchdown at the end when they were that kind of choke. That's the kind of thing I want to see.
Yeah, this is coming from a kid who grew up in a household. I was raised as an Ohio State fan, and my childhood traumas consist of Michigan beating the John Cooper Buckeyes over and over again in the 90s. I would rather see Michigan win the national title than Georgia win the national title. And I hate Michigan with a pat. I mean, even in my family text threads, that week, the letter M becomes an X, right? Just like you don't type the letter M for the whole week. I don't like Michigan. I'd rather see Michigan win a national title than see Georgia win another.
That is the correct answer.
Yeah, and I don't want either to win. So I don't want either to win. But it's just, I don't understand the logic to root for Georgia as a Florida fan at all. That's terrible. That's terrible. All right, good show. We got the Las Vegas Bowl here on Saturday. Last game of the season for the Florida Gators. It's been a quick year, man, but here we are already at the bowl game, and looking forward to seeing what Jack Miller and the Gators can do on Saturday. Will, for
Absolutely.
Will Miles.
Go ahead. You only get 13 of these, right?
Exactly.
We got one left. Season's almost over. I can't believe it. So, hey, look, enjoy it while you can, and let's have a good time. Hopefully, we come up with a win.
For Will Miles, I'm Nick Knutson. Have a great week, everybody, and go Gators. Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week, and check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.